Hello everyone, Memory here. I have been looking into more details as to how my ShotgunSwordsman actually functions, and I'm currently up to the tier 14 maps with this build, without using a 6-link. This build actually turns out to be fairly decent if you have the right things in the right place. And it turns out that I was correct about there is something wrong with the build so that no one is playing it this league, even though it received the buff. When I was doing my research on this skill, I found many mixed information about how it can shotgun to increase the damage at close range and stuff like that, which is what gives it the super high single target DPS. But that was the case when this skill was first introduced. It did receive the rework near the end of 2020, and that change stopped the projectiles from hitting the same target more than once. What they did to compensate the huge damage loss is to give it a big damage boost at the cost of consuming 2 shots. It also buffed its overall damage, especially at close range. Now of course all these damage buffs are not going to make the new version of the skill to compete with the old version when it comes to single target DPS, so understandably no one wanna play the skill anymore. But with the recent damage buff, it can perform well enough as a league starter since none of the gears that I have at the moment is expensive, and I'm already on red maps. It does require some tweaks on the build compared to the version in the first episode, because in that version, I assume it still had the old shotgun mechanics when I first theory crafted the character. Now here is where it gets a bit complicated. Technically, it still has some shotgunning effects, just not as reliable and easy to control as before. How it works is the projectile it fires cannot shotgun, but the area damage after the projectile explode are able to hit the same target. That means if you position yourself so that the enemy are in the projectile explosion range, you can still achieve some shotgunning effect. That means the enemy can't be too far nor too close to you, otherwise you will lose out on a lot of damage. I was kinda struggling to do tier 8 maps with the setup I had in the last video, and after I made some changes that made more sense to this mechanic, I was immediately able to do tier 11 maps, which is definitely an improvement. Now to make the correct adjustment to the skill, we need to view the skill like this. The initial area here is where the projectile travels. In this area, you're only ever gonna hit the target once, no matter how many projectiles made contacts with the target. The next area is the explosion area, where the projectile explodes in a cone shape. This is the shotgun area, where each different cones are able to hit the same target. Now here you might have a question. Since the projectile explodes when they hit a target, if the target is right in front of you, wouldn't all the projectile explode when they made contact with it? And even though it only received 1 projectile damage from that, but it should be damaged by all the explosion afterwards and therefore achieving the shotgunning effect? The answer is, of course not. I'm not sure about the exact reason, but from my testing, it doesn't work that way. As you can see here, my testing character only have greater multiple projectile linked with shattering steel, and the character does not have pierce. If this logic works, the enemy that are closer to me should be the ones to die first, or at least die at the same time as everything else, but instead the mobs in the explosion zone always dies first. That means either only 1 projectile actually collided with the first enemy, so only 1 projectile exploded early, or the enemy does not get hit by the explosion created by the projectile that it hit, because the explosion happens behind the mob after collision. And I think the second option is more likely to be true, but either way, the fact is we can't create the shotgunning effect by trying to stand at point blank range with the enemy. So to overlap as many explosions on the same target as possible, first we need to use slower projectile support, because projectile speed is the main thing that controls how far the projectile travels before they explode. Slower projectiles means they travel less distance before they explode, which makes it easier to position the enemy in the explosion area. It also kinda overlapped the cone explosions more because of the geometry of the skill. And because we know that low projectile speed is good for us, we also need to make some changes on the passive tree. I took out Fury Bolts over here because it has increased projectile speed. And since we do need the strength provided on the Fury Bolt to activate the Nomad belt, I took the Path of Warrior up here to get my strength over 200. Then I took the adjacent animosity over here, which gives us reduced projectile speed and also some projectile damage. And then the second support gem we use is increased area of effect. The awakened version is actually not that expensive when I searched for it, so I got that instead. What this does is it increases the size of the cone explosion, so that the target is more likely to be hit by multiple cones, especially near the end of the explosion. I was using concentrated effect in my last video, so swapping that for increased area support almost double my AOE. I also made another change to my gear, and that is to use Carcass Jack armor instead of Lion Eyes Vision, which gave me another awakened increased area of effect gem worth of AOE. With this change, my tool tip damage tells me I lost around 10% damage, but I feel like I gained more than 30% damage in practice. It also made the map clear way faster since my explosion now reached about 2/3 of the way to the edge of the screen sideways. And after a few maps of testing, I'm fairly certain that this change gave me more overall damage than before because I'm hitting everything with more cones explosions at once. The other two support gems I have now are Impale and Brutality, where Impale gives us 100% Impale chance, and Brutality gives us the highest damage boost out of all other gems. Now here's another question. Should you use greater multiple projectiles because we are now making use of the shotgunning effect on this skill properly? And the answer is no. Because when you increase the number of projectiles on Shattering Steel, it will also increase the angle that the projectile spreads, like so on the screen. That means increasing 4 extra projectiles does not necessarily mean you are going to hit the boss with 4 extra cone explosions. It's more like extra 2 projectiles at max from my testing. So you don't really want more than 4 projectiles for this skill, because anything more than that will have a diminished return for your investment. Divergent Shattering Steel already gives you 4 projectiles, so you don't need any more items that gives you extra projectiles. With that said, I'm still using Belt Timber Sword at the moment because it already has decent physical DPS, so the extra 2 projectiles on it is just a cherry on top. I will swap it out with a better sword in the future after I get my 6th link armor, because from my testing, higher physical DPS on the weapon is definitely better than the 2 extra projectiles on the Belt Timber. The Belt Timber Sword has around 300 physical DPS, so I'd say any sword that has more than 360 physical DPS with around 1.7 attack speed on it will be better than the Belt Timber. And finally, looking back to our passive tree, I've done the Final Ascendancy trial and got the Unstoppable Hero passive. Pairing that with the Rampart passive over here, our Fortify gave us quite a bit of defensive and offensive stat. I got the Fortify by using the helmet enchantment. Shattering Steel grants Fortify. You can also use Fortify support on Leap Slam if you can't find a cheap helmet with this enchant. And of course we have the Cluster Jewels. For the large cluster, you want the physical damage one, with Iron Breaker, Bottle Hardened, and Force Multiplier. This one is around 50 chaos to 1 exalt at the moment, and I bought mine for 60 chaos. As for the medium cluster jewel, you want the projectile damage one, with Eye to Eye and Repeater. This one should be a bit cheaper than the large cluster, at around 50 chaos to 80 chaos, but I also bought mine for 60 chaos. As for the empty sockets on my medium clusters, I filled them with life and resistance, and that's it. They should be very cheap, like 5 chaos or something. And again, I will have the updated version of POE for what I currently have down in the description, so just follow that and you should be fine. With all these changes, I was able to do tier 14 maps using the 5-link setup without too much problems. This is a success in my book as a solid build. I'm pretty sure with more investment into the character, it can definitely clear all contents. This current setup should be fairly friendly for most players to build because most of the gears are around 5 chaos and the more expensive parts are no more than 1 exalt. Compared to the machine gun turrets, this is an even cheaper build that can get you to tier 14 maps. I might start looking into another build again because this build doesn't seem to be all that popular. So for now, this would be the last episode on this build. But if I feel like it somehow becomes popular, I'll definitely make another one to take this build to a higher level. Anyways, that's it for today. Subscribe for an extra mirror drop chance. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.